the North St. Vrain Hunger. The sky over Lyons did not merely darken. It bruised a deep, necrotic purple that bled into the jagged horizon of the Front Range before the whiteout swallowed the world whole. I have lived in the shadow of these mountains for 42 years, and I have seen the way the Norston Vrain Creek can turn from a babbling tourist attraction into a churning, silt-choked engine of destruction. I remember the floods of 2013, the way the water carried houses like driftwood. But this was different. This was not a liquid threat. It was a solid one. It was a wall of ice and silence that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in the span of an hour, sealing the canyon roads with a finality that felt less like weather and more like a tombstone being slid into place. I am a man of measurements. I work in civil engineering, or I did before the town started to crumble under its own weight. I believe in the thermal conductivity of stone, the tensile strength of steel, and the predictable behavior of hydraulic systems. I do not believe in the ghost stories the old-timers tell at the Spirit Hound distillery, and I certainly do not believe in the things they say hide in the deep pools beneath the Apple Valley Bridge. Or at least I didn't. Not until the power went out, and the screaming started. The blizzard hit on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the snow was 5 feet deep and still falling in heavy, wet sheets that muffled all sound. The town of Lyons was a frozen cage. The roads to Estes Park were gone, buried under drifts that looked like the spines of sleeping giants. The power lines had snapped under the weight of the ice, leaving us in a darkness so thick it felt tactile. I sat in my house on the edge of the creek, wrapped in 3 layers of wool, watching the flickering orange glow of my wood stove. I told myself that the scratching I heard against the exterior walls was just the wind, just branches of the cottonwoods clawing at the siding in a desperate attempt to stay upright. But branches don't have fingernails, and branches don't moan with a sound that mimics the vibration of a cello string snapped in a freezer. I am an unreliable witness, or so the doctors might say if there were any left to hear me. The cold does things to the brain. It slows the synapses, turns the blood to slush, and makes the eyes play tricks. I was shivering so hard, my teeth ached, my mind looping through calculations of how long my cord of oak would last. I should have been focused on survival. Instead, I found myself staring out the frosted window at the Ast, Vrain. The creek should have been frozen solid, a static ribbon of white. But it wasn't the water was moving. A dark, churning artery of black ice and slush. And out of that water, things were climbing. They were pale. That is the first thing I noticed. A whiteness that was distinct from the snow. A sickly, translucent pallor, like the belly of a dead fish left to rot in the sun. They were thin, their ribs standing out like the rafters of a ruined barn, their limbs elongated and ending in fingers that were too long, too many jointed. I watched, my breath hitching in my throat, as one of them hauled itself onto the bank. It moved with a terrifying fluid grace, its skin glistening with a coating of freezing slime. It didn't seem to feel the cold. It embraced it. It turned its head. A hairless, bulbous thing with no nose and eyes that were nothing more than milky orbs of cataract white. And it sniffed the air. I ducked below the sill, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Hypothermia, I whispered to the empty room. Stage 2. Hallucinations. The brain is shutting down. I repeated the words like a mantra, a scientific shield against the impossible, but then came the sound of glass shattering in the kitchen. I grabbed my heavy iron poker from the hearth. My hands were numb, my grip clumsy. I crept toward the kitchen, the floorboards groaning under my boots. The smell hit me first. A stench of stagnant pond water, wet fur, and something metallic, like a copper pipe rusted through with old blood. The window above the sink was gone. Shards of glass littered the linoleum, glinting like diamonds in the dim light. And there, hunched over the counter, was one of them. It was smaller than the one I'd seen outside, but no less grotesque. It was feeding on a raw chicken I'd left out to thaw. It didn't chew. It tore, its mouth opening wider than a human jaw should be possible, revealing rows of needle-thin, translucent teeth that looked like they were carved from ice. It made a wet, clicking sound in its throat as it felt my presence. It turned the raw poultry hanging from its maw like a shredded ribbon. I didn't think. I swung the poker with every ounce of panicked strength I had left. The iron whistled through the air and connected with the creature's temple. There was no crack of bone, only a dull, wet thud, as if I'd hit a bag of half-frozen meat. The creature spun, its milky eyes widening, and it let out a hiss that sprayed a mist of freezing ichor across my face. The liquid burned. It wasn't cold. It was caustic, a searing chemical heat that made my skin blister instantly. I swung again, and this time the poker buried itself in the thing's chest. It didn't bleed red. It leaked a thick, viscous gray fluid that smelled of ozone and rot. The creature clawed at the iron, its elongated fingers leaving deep gouges in the metal, before it finally slumped to the floor, twitching in a rhythmic serpentine fashion. I stood over it, gasping for air, my mind screaming that this was a violation of every law of biology. I knew it was a pale drifter. That was the name that bubbled up from the dark recesses of my memory, a scrap of local folklore I'd dismissed as the ramblings of a drunkard. They said they came from the deep aquifers, the hidden river systems that honeycombed the Rockies, rising only when the world above matched the freezing darkness of their home. I couldn't stay in the house. The window was open, the cold was pouring in, and I knew there were more of them. I could hear them now, a chorus of wet slaps against the siding, 1,000 clicking tongues. I grabbed my heavy coat, a flashlight, and my father's old .30-06. I didn't know if bullets would work on things that didn't have hearts, but I wasn't going to die with my hands empty. I stepped out into the blizzard, and the world vanished. The wind was a physical weight, a white fist that tried to shove me back into the house. I waded through the snow, my flashlight beam cutting a pathetic yellow hole in the gloom. I lived on the outskirts, near the entrance to the canyon, and the nearest shelter was the Lyons Elementary School, where the town's emergency plan dictated everyone should gather in case of a total grid failure. It was only half a mile, but in this weather, it might as well have been across the ocean. As I struggled toward the center of town, I saw the carnage. It was a splatter film nightmare rendered in shades of white and gray. I passed the Miller house. The front door had been torn from its hinges. On the porch, Mrs. Miller lay in a pool of frozen crimson. They hadn't just killed her, they had harvested her. Her chest cavity had been pried open, the ribs snapped outward like the petals of a gruesome flower. Her internal organs were gone, replaced by a dusting of fine, powdery snow. The pale drifters weren't just hungry for blood. They were hungry for heat. They were parasitic radiators, draining the warmth from the living to fuel their own unnatural metabolism. I heard a scream from the direction of the creek, a high, thin sound that was cut short by a wet, gurgling pop. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. My logic was failing me, replaced by a primal, lizard brain urge to run. I saw one of the creatures perched atop a stranded sieve, its long limbs draped over the roof like a pale spider. It was watching me. It didn't attack. It simply watched, its head tilting from side to side with a bird-like curiosity. I raised the rifle and fired. The kickback jolted my shoulder, and the creature was blown off the car, a spray of gray mist erupting from its shoulder. It didn't scream. It just vanished into the whiteout. I reached the main road, or what I assumed was the main road. The landmarks were gone, buried under the shifting dunes of the storm. The only thing that guided me was the sound of the emergency siren. It had started a few minutes ago, a low, mournful wail that rose and fell, cutting through the wind. It was the signal, the all clear or the gather here. It was the sound of civilization, of a plan, of safety. I followed it, my boots heavy with ice, my lungs burning with every breath of the sub-zero air. I saw others as I approached the school, shadows in the dark, huddled figures, moving toward the light of a few flickering lanterns near the gym entrance. I saw Officer Rusk, a woman I'd known for 20 years, a pillar of the community, standing by the door, her face a mask of frozen terror. She was waving people in, her service pistol clutched in a trembling hand. "Arthur!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the siren. "Get inside! Move!" I stumbled toward her, my legs feeling like lead. "Rusk, they're in the water! They're coming up from the creek!" "I know," she said, her eyes darting to the darkness behind me. "We've seen them. We've lost 10 people already. Maybe more. Get into the gym. We're barricading the doors." Inside the gym was a cavern of misery. There were perhaps 60 people there. Families huddled on wrestling mats. Elderly residents wrapped in emergency blankets. The air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. The mayor, Gregor Shaw, was pacing near the stage, his expensive coat stained with soot. He was trying to project an image of calm, but his eyes were wide and bloodshot. "We have plenty of supplies." Gregor was saying to a crying woman, "The National Guard will be here as soon as the pass is cleared. We just have to wait." "The pass won't be cleared for days, Gregor," I said, my voice rasping. I leaned against the brick wall, the heat of the room making my blistered face throb with agonizing intensity. "And those things, they aren't waiting." "We're safe here, Arthur," Gregor snapped, his voice cracking. "The walls are thick. Rusk has men at the doors. We have the siren going to guide anyone else who's lost in the storm. It's the protocol, the siren." It was loud in here, a rhythmic thrum that vibrated in the floorboards. It was a comfort to some, a steady heartbeat of authority. But as I sat there watching the shadows dance on the ceiling, a cold realization began to dawn on me. I thought back to the creature on the Sioux, the way it hadn't attacked me, the way it had seemed to be listening. "Turn it off," I said, standing up. Gregor looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. "What? The siren. Turn it off now. It's a beacon, you idiot," Gregor spat. "It's how we find the survivors." "It's not a beacon," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "It's a dinner bell." The room went silent, save for the wail of the siren. Rusk walked over, her brow furrowed. "Arthur, what are you talking about?" "They're aquatic," I said, my mind racing through the biological implications. "They move through the river systems. They use vibration to hunt in the dark. The creek is right behind the school, Rusk, that siren. It's sending out a massive rhythmic pulse through the ground and the air. You're not calling the townspeople. You're calling them Dot, as if on cue." The siren reached a crescendo, a high-pitched shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. And then another sound joined it, a scratching, 1,000 fingernails against the brick, 1,000 wet slaps against the high windows of the gymnasium. "They're on the roof," someone screamed. The first window shattered with a sound like a gunshot. A pale drifter dropped from the rafters, landing in the center of a group of children. It was a blur of translucent limbs and needle teeth. The scream that followed was not human. It was the sound of a life being extinguished in a spray of hot, steaming blood. The creature didn't stop to feed. It disemboweled the nearest person with a single swipe of its serrated claws and moved to the next, its movements a frenzied, kinetic dance of slaughter. "Open fire!" Rusk screamed, but it was too late. The ceiling was raining monsters. They came through the vents, through the skylights, through the very gaps in the doors. The gym, which had felt like a sanctuary, was now a kill box. I saw Thomas, the local mortician's son, get tackled by 2 of the things. They didn't bite his neck. They latched onto his limbs and pulled, their strength inhuman. I watched in a daze of horror as his arms were torn from his sockets, with a sound like wet parchment, ripping. The blood didn't just pool, it steamed in the freezing air that was now rushing into the room. I raised my rifle and fired into the mass of pale flesh. One went down, its head exploding in a cloud of gray brain matter and ice crystals, but 3 more took its place. They were relentless. They didn't feel pain, and they didn't have fear. They were a collective hunger, a tide of frozen death that had been waiting for this exact moment. The room was a symphony of gore. I saw a woman I recognized from the grocery store being dragged toward the broken window, her fingers clawing at the floorboards until her nails snapped off. I saw Gregor Shaw try to hide under the stage, only to be pulled out by his ankles, his screams echoing in the hollow space before they were replaced by the sound of crunching bone. I found myself backed into a corner with Rusk. She was out of ammunition, swinging her heavy flashlight like a club. Her face was splattered with that caustic gray ichor, her skin already beginning to peel away in weeping strips. "The basement," she gasped. "The boiler room!" There's a heavy steel door. We fought our way through the carnage. It wasn't a fight. It was a desperate, stumbling crawl over the bodies of our neighbors. The floor was slick with blood and slush, making every step a gamble. I saw a drifter hunched over a pile of corpses, its belly distended and glowing with a faint, ghostly light. It looked up at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of something that wasn't just hunger. It was a cold, ancient intelligence. It knew we had nowhere to go. We reached the basement stairs and tumbled down, the darkness of the lower level rising to meet us. Rusk slammed the steel door shut and threw the bolt just as a heavy weight slammed into the other side. The metal groaned, but it held. We were in the dark, the only sound the frantic gasping of our breath and the muffled screams from above. The siren was still going, a relentless, mocking wail that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. "We have to turn it off," I whispered. "If we don't, they'll never stop coming. They'll bring every drifter from the whole mountain range." "The control panel is in the main office," Rusk said, her voice trembling. "Above us." In the middle of that meat market. I looked at her. Her eyes were glazed, her breathing shallow. She wasn't going to make it. The ichor was eating into her skull. The chemical burned deep and jagged. I felt a strange sense of detachment. My logic had returned, but it was a cold, hollow version of its former self. I realized that I wasn't shivering anymore. In fact, I felt quite warm. I looked down at my hands. They were pale. Paler than they should be, and the blistered skin on my face didn't hurt anymore. It felt tight, like a new suit of clothes. "Arthur?" Rusk asked, her voice a faint rasp. "What are you doing?" I reached out and touched the steel door. I could feel the vibrations of the creatures on the other side. I could feel their hunger. It was a beautiful rhythmic thing. It was a measurement I finally understood. "I'm going to turn it off, Rusk," I said. My voice sounded different, thinner with a wet clicking undertone. But not because I want them to stop. I want them to settle in. I want them to stay. I realized then that I was the unreliable narrator of my own life. I hadn't been hallucinating the cold. I had been inviting it, the creature in my kitchen. I hadn't killed it out of self-defense. I had killed it because it was in my house, eating my food. I was the night marshal of this frozen hell, and the violations I saw everywhere were the violations of the living. Their stubborn, wasteful heat a stain on the perfect silent white of the world. I opened the door. Rusk didn't even have time to scream. I wasn't the man I was an hour ago. I was something leaner, something faster. I felt the needle teeth in my jaw ache, with a sudden, overwhelming need to feed. I didn't use the rifle. I used my hands. They were so long now, so many jointed. The gym was quiet when I emerged. The screaming had stopped, replaced by the rhythmic sound of 60 creatures feeding in unison. The siren was still wailing, but I walked to the office and flipped the switch. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I walked to the window and looked out at the Steve rain. The blizzard was still raging. The world a masterpiece of white and gray. I could see more of them climbing out of the water, drawn by the lingering echoes of the siren, their pale bodies ghostly against the snow. I felt a pang of hunger, not for food, but for the heat that was still radiating from the pile of bodies in the center of the room. I joined my brothers and sisters on the floor. The blood was cooling, turning to a thick crimson slush, but there was still enough warmth in the marrow to last through the night. They said the North St. Vrain was bottomless. They said the things that lived in the deep were forgotten, but we aren't forgotten. We are the audit that this town has been avoiding for 100 years. Every forged permit, every buried secret, every cold-hearted choice made by the people of Lyons. It all led to this. The rot in the town's foundation had finally met the ice in its veins. I looked at my reflection in a pool of frozen blood. My eyes were milky white, my nose gone, my skin a translucent map of veins and gray fluid. I was no longer a man of measurements. I was the measurement. I was the zero on the thermometer. The blizzard continued to howl, burying the school, the town, and the remains of the people I once knew. We would wait here, in the dark, until the spring thaw, and when the water began to flow again, we would flow with it, down into the valleys, into the cities, into every warm, pulsing heart of the world. The hunger is not a curse. It is a sentence, and we are the ones who carry it out. As I lay there, curled around a cooling rib cage, I thought I heard a sound from the basement, a knocking, a rhythmic, desperate thudding against the steel door I had left open. I ignored it. Let them knock, let them pray to a god of heat and light. The sun was never coming back to Lyons. The whiteout was permanent, and we, the pale drifters, were finally beautifully home. The snow piled higher against the windows, sealing us in our tomb of meat and ice. I closed my eyes, or what were now my eyes, and listened to the silence. It was the sound of a world finally balanced. No more noise, no more heat, just the cold, the dark, and the endless aching hunger of the St. Vrain. I remembered a name then, Sarah, or was it Mara? No, those names were gone. They were sounds for people who needed names. I didn't need a name. I needed the marrow. I needed the silence. I needed the North St. Vrain to swallow everything until there was nothing left but the ice. The town of Lyons was gone. It was just a mark on a map that would soon be wiped clean by the wind. And as the last of the lanterns flickered out, leaving us in the perfect, absolute dark, I finally felt at peace. The skeptic was dead. The engineer was gone. There was only the drifter, and the drifter was hungry. The blizzard screamed one last time, a high, lonely sound that echoed through the empty canyons before it too faded into the white. The hunt was over for tonight, but the winter was long. Oh, so very long, and we had only just begun to eat. I reached out and touched the hand of the creature next to me. It was cold, it was perfect. We clicked our tongues in unison, a sound like ice cracking on a deep lake, and settled in to wait for the next siren to call us to the feast. The world was white, the world was gray, and the hunger was the only thing that was real. I thought of the quarry, the old Graybridge site, where the water was deep and the stones were sharp. Maybe we would go there next. Or maybe the tunnels beneath the town hall, where the secrets were buried in the mud. It didn't matter. The river was our road, and the road led everywhere. The North Vrain Hunger was not a freak occurrence. It was an awakening. And as the ice thickened over the creek, I knew that we would never go back into the dark. We had tasted the warmth, and we would never let it go. The silence was absolute. The cold was eternal. And I, Arthur, the man who didn't believe in ghosts, was the most terrifying ghost of all. I let the darkness take me, falling into a sleep that was as deep and cold as the river itself. When I woke, the world would be even whiter, and I would be even hungrier. The end of Lyons was not a bang or a whimper. It was a click, a wet, cold, rhythmic click, and then nothing. The nothing was not an end, but a recalibration. In the dark of the gym, the silence was a physical weight, a pressurized vacuum that pressed against my new, translucent eardrums. I could hear things now that the man named Arthur had been deaf to. I heard the slow, tectonic groan of the school's foundation settling into the permafrost. I heard the frantic, microscopic scuttle of ice crystals forming on the eyelashes of the dead, and beneath it all, the heartbeat. Not a human heart, but the rhythmic, thrumming pulse of the North St. Vrain, flowing beneath the ice like blood through a frozen artery. I stirred. My limbs moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, the joints clicking in a language of precision. The floor, once a sticky mess of gore and slush, was now a map of thermal gradients. I could see the heat signatures of my kin, faint, ethereal glows of pale blue and violet, radiating from their distended midsections. We were the only light in the room. The hunger was a hum in my marrow. It wasn't the gnawing ache of a starving man. It was a vacuum, a structural necessity. The audit required more data, more fuel. I looked down at the body I had been feeding on. It was a man I had known, a volunteer firefighter named Miller. I remember he used to complain about the humidity in August. Now he was a cooling engine, his thermal output dropping toward the beautiful, absolute zero of the room. I reached out, my fingers, longer now, tipped with something that felt like obsidian, and traced the line of his collarbone. I wasn't looking for meat. I was looking for the residual echoes of his life, the tiny flickering sparks of bioelectricity that still clung to his nerves. I leaned down and pressed my face against his chest. I didn't breathe. I inhaled the scent of his fading heat. It tasted like copper and old memories. Click, click, click. The sound came from the creature to my left. It was larger than the others. Its skin so thin I could see the rhythmic churning of gray ichor in its throat. It was watching me with those milky, lidless eyes. It wasn't a challenge. It was a communication. The basement, it signaled through the vibration of its clicking jaw. The violation remains. I remembered. Rusk. I stood up, my spine unfolding like a carpenter's rule. My height was wrong. I was too tall. My center of gravity shifted forward, my knuckles nearly. Grazing the floor, I liked it. The world was no longer a place to be inhabited. It was a structure to be dismantled. I walked toward the basement door. My feet made no sound on the blood-slicked floor. I didn't need a flashlight. The dark was a spectrum of grays and silvers, rich with detail. I could see the individual fibers of the wood, the microscopic cracks in the steel door, the way the cold had begun to crystallize the very air we breathed. The door was still open, just as I had left it. I descended the stairs, my movements a series of sharp, angular lunges. The air in the basement was warmer than the gym. A disgusting, humid warmth that felt like a slap across my face. It was the heat of the boiler, still chugging away in its mindless, mechanical stubbornness, trying to fight the inevitable. I reached the bottom of the stairs. The boiler room was a cavern of shadows and hissing steam, and there, huddled in the corner behind a stack of rusted folding chairs, was the heat signature, Rusk. She was a supernova in the dark. Her body was a riot of oranges, reds, and yellows, a screaming defiance against the perfection of the frost. The ichor on her face had turned into a crust of gray salt, but underneath, the blood was still pumping, still wasting energy, still burning. "Arthur?" she whispered. The sound of my old name was like a jagged piece of glass dragged across a violin string. It was a noise of friction, of heat, of life. It was offensive. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My vocal cords had thickened, fused into something designed for resonance, not speech. I moved toward her, my shadow stretching out like a many-limbed inkblot on the concrete floor. "Arthur, please," she sobbed. She held her heavy flashlight, but she didn't turn it on. Perhaps she knew that light would only make the nightmare more vivid. "I know you're in there. I saw you. I saw what you did to the siren." I stopped a few feet from her. I could smell the terror coming off her in waves, a sharp, acrid scent like burning rubber. Her heart was beating at 110 beats per minute. Her internal temperature was 98.6 degrees. A massive, wasteful expenditure of resources. I tilted my head, the vertebrae in my neck popping with a sound like dry kindling. I was analyzing her. She was a variable that needed to be resolved. She was a leak in the system. I reached out a hand. The skin of my palm was rough, like shark skin, designed to grip wet stone in a rushing current. I touched the side of her neck, where the carotid artery throbbed with a frantic, desperate rhythm. She froze. The cold from my hand must have felt like a brand of dry ice. I felt her shiver, a violent, full-body tremor. You're so cold," she breathed. I leaned in closer. I wanted to hear the internal mechanics of her body. I wanted to understand the failure of her biology. I pressed my ear to her chest, and for a moment I was a man again, listening to the heartbeat of a friend. But then the hunger flared, a cold, white-hot vacuum in my gut. It wasn't hunger for her flesh. It was hunger for her stasis. I wanted to stop the beating. I wanted to plug the leak. I opened my mouth, my jaw unhinged, the skin stretching taut until it was translucent. My teeth, needle-thin and translucent as ice, ached with the need to conduct the cold into her warm, wasteful center. "Arthur, don't." I bit down, not on her throat but on her shoulder, where the heat was most concentrated. The taste was transformative. Human blood is salt and iron, but to me it was a surge of raw, unrefined energy. It flowed into me, and for a second the world turned bright, agonizing white. I felt her life force being audited, subtracted from her and added to the Norths in Vrain. She didn't scream the cold from my saliva. The caustic gray ichor acted as a local anesthetic, freezing her nerves even as I tore through the muscle. She just slumped against me, her heat bleeding out into the cold concrete floor. I drank until the orange glow of her body began to fade into a dull, muddy brown. I drank until her heart slowed to a rhythmic, sluggish thud. I drank until she was no longer a violation, but a part of the silence. When I finally pulled away, she was still alive, but she was no longer Rusk. She was a vessel, cooling rapidly. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, the pupils blown wide and reflecting the faint, ghostly light from my own skin. I stood up and looked at her. The audit of the boiler room was complete. Click. I turned to the boiler itself. It was a massive iron beast, its belly full of fire and water. It was the heart of the school's resistance. I walked over to it, my hands finding the main gas line. I didn't use a tool. I simply gripped the pipe and twisted. The metal shrieked as it gave way. The smell of natural gas filled the room, a thick, oily scent. I didn't stop there. I found the water intake and shattered the valve. Steam hissed out in a blinding cloud, but it didn't bother me. I walked into the heart of the vapor, feeling the heat try to cling to my skin, only to be neutralized by the absolute chill of my new biology. The fire in the boiler flickered and died as the water flooded the combustion chamber. The mechanical humming ceased. Silence returned to the basement, a perfect, heavy silence. I walked back to the stairs, leaving Rusk to freeze in the dark. She would be one of us soon, or she would be nothing. Either way, the balance was restored. As I climbed back into the gym, I saw that the others were preparing to leave. The 60 or so drifters were moving in a coordinated, rhythmic dance, their long limbs weaving together as they headed toward the shattered windows. The storm outside had reached a new level of intensity. The wind was no longer a howl. It was a roar, a solid wall of white that sought to scrub the world clean. I joined the line. We moved through the windows and out into the night. The snow was waist-deep to a human. But for us, it was nothing. We moved on top of it, our wide, splayed feet acting like snowshoes. The world was a masterpiece of desolation. The houses of Lyons were nothing but humps in the snow, their windows dark, their chimneys cold. We moved toward the river. The North St. Vrain was a jagged scar of ice cutting through the town. But beneath the ice, the water was still moving, a dark churning force that called to us. We reached the banks and, one by one, we slipped into the water. The transition was exquisite. The air had been cold, but the water was pure. It rushed over my skin, stripping away the last vestiges of my humanity, the last lingering sense of the gym and the blood. I felt the current take me, a powerful, relentless hand pulling me down into the depths. I didn't need to swim. I was part of the flow. I saw my brothers and sisters around me, their bodies glowing like deep-sea fish in the murky, ice-choked water. We were a ribbon of pale light moving through the dark. We passed under the bridge at 4th Street. I looked up and saw the underside of the concrete, thick with icicles like the teeth of a giant. I remembered being a man on that bridge, looking down at the water and thinking it was beautiful. I had been wrong. It wasn't beautiful. It was necessary. We were heading toward the quarry, the Graybridge site. The water there was deep, deeper than any map showed. There were flooded tunnels that stretched back into the mountains, ancient veins of the earth that had been dry for millennia, until the town had dug too deep as we swam. I felt a new sensation, a collective resonance. I wasn't just Arthur anymore. I was a node in a network. I could feel the hunger of the creature 10 yards ahead of me. I could feel the satisfaction of the one behind. We were a single organism, a multi-limbed beast of ice and shadow, performing a grand geological audit of the valley. We reached the quarry. The water here was still, a dark mirror reflecting the storm-racked sky above. We dived. Down we went, away from the wind, away from the light. The pressure increased, pressing against my ribs, but it felt right. It felt like a homecoming. At the bottom of the quarry, among the rusted remains of mining equipment, and the bones of things that had fallen in over the years, there was a fissure. It was a jagged, vertical crack in the granite, emitting a faint, rhythmic pulse of gray light. This was the source. This was the throat of the Northern Vrain. We entered the fissure. The walls were smooth, polished by eons of rushing water. The temperature dropped even further here, past the freezing point of salt water, into a realm of cold that shouldn't exist. My thoughts began to slow, to crystallize. We emerged into a vast underground cathedral of ice. The ceiling was hundreds of feet high, draped with translucent curtains of frozen runoff. The floor was a forest of stalagmites, each one containing a frozen figure. I saw them, thousands of them. People from a century ago, dressed in the heavy wool of miners and the long dresses of pioneer women. They were perfectly preserved, their faces caught in expressions of quiet, frozen awe. They weren't dead, not exactly. They were in stasis. They were the archive. We took our places among them. There were empty spots, niches in the ice waiting for new entries. I found a hollow that fit my body perfectly. I backed into it, the ice molding itself to my spine. I looked out at the chamber. The other drifters were doing the same, settling into their frozen tomb. The gray light from the fissure began to fade as the blizzard above sealed the quarry. With a plug of ice 100 feet thick, the hunger was still there, but it was quiet now. A pilot light in the dark. I closed my eyes. I thought of the town above, the empty streets, the frozen gym, the woman in the basement. They were all part of the audit now. The numbers had been crunched, the debt had been paid, but the winter was long. I felt a vibration in the ice, a distant, rhythmic thudding. It was coming from above, from the world of heat and noise. Someone was digging, someone was trying to find us. I felt a surge of cold, pale joy. The audit wasn't over. The spring thaw was months away, and there were still so many violations left to find. I waited. We all waited, in the silence of the ice cathedral. I heard the faint, wet click of my own jaw click. The north St. Vrain was hungry, and the world was still so very warm. The snow didn't just fall, it conquered. By the third day of the Great Whiteout, the town of Lyons had ceased to exist as a geographical entity. It was a series of white mounds, a topographical anomaly in a landscape of absolute erasure. The National Guard had tried to move in from Longmont, but their Humvees had been swallowed by drifts that defied the laws of physics. Snow that seemed to flow like liquid, piling 20 feet high in minutes, only to vanish and reappear elsewhere. The helicopters couldn't fly. The air was too thick with ice crystals, a diamond dust that shredded turbines and blinded sensors. Lyons was an island in a sea of white, but inside the white, there was movement. On the surface, the audit was being carried out with clinical efficiency. The pale drifters, my brothers, my sisters, were no longer hiding. We didn't need to. The town was our larder, and the few remaining pockets of heat were like beacons in the dark. I emerged from the quarry on the fourth night. The ice had not claimed me yet. I was needed for the harvest. I stood on the ridge overlooking the town. My new eyes could see through the blizzard, picking out the infrared signatures of the survivors. There was a group in the basement of the town hall, another in the back of the grocery store. They were huddled together, sharing the last of their warmth, unaware that their very survival was what drew us to them. I felt the clicking in my jaw intensify. It was a command, the town hall. I began to descend the ridge. My movements were a blur of gray against the white. I didn't feel the wind. I didn't feel the cold. I was the cold. As I reached the outskirts of town, I passed the remains of a barricade. A truck had been overturned, its engine block cracked by the sudden drop in temperature. Beside it lay a man, frozen mid-crawl. I paused to look at him. His eyes were wide, the corneas turned to milk. He had been trying to reach the "Welcome to Lyons" sign, as if the wooden board could offer him some kind of sanctuary. I reached out and snapped off his frozen arm. It came away with a sound like a dry branch breaking. I didn't eat it, I just held it, marveling at the structural integrity of the frozen marrow. It was beautiful, it was balanced. I dropped the limb and continued toward the town hall. The building was a sturdy, stone structure, built to withstand the floods of the St. Vrain, but it wasn't built for us. I reached the front doors and pressed my palms against the wood. I could feel the heat on the other side. A dozen humans, a small wood stove, the frantic, wet sound of their breathing. They were talking, they were praying. "We just have to wait for the plow," a voice said. It was Mayor Henderson, I remembered him. He had once fined me for an unpermitted shed. The county will get through, they have to. I tilted my head. The county will not get through. Mayor, I thought. The county is being audited. I didn't smash the door, that would be a waste of energy. Instead, I found the seams, the small gaps where the wood met the stone, where the hinges were anchored. I began to secrete the gray ichor from my fingertips. It hissed as it touched the wood, dissolving the fibers, turning the solid oak into a soft, pulpy mush. In minutes, the door was no longer a barrier. It was a suggestion. I pushed. The door disintegrated, falling inward in a shower of gray splinters and freezing slush. The screaming started immediately. The room was lit by a single flickering lantern. In the dim light, the humans looked like frantic, clumsy animals. Henderson was there, along with his secretary, 2 police officers, and a handful of residents. They had guns, but they were shaking so hard the barrels were dancing. "God, what is that? What is that thing?" Someone shrieked. I stepped into the room. Behind me, 3 more drifters slipped through the opening, their pale bodies glistening in the lantern light. One of the officers fired. The bullet hit me in the chest, but there was no pain. There was only a dull thud, the lead mushrooming against my frozen rib cage and falling harmlessly to the floor. I didn't bleed red. A small puff of gray vapor escaped the wound, then sealed itself instantly. I moved. I was across the room before the officer could chamber another round. I didn't use my teeth this time. I used my hands. I gripped his head, my fingers sinking into his temples like they were made of soft clay. I felt the heat of his brain, the frantic electrical storm of his terror, and then... click! I squeezed. The heat vanished. The storm ended. The others were busy. The room was a whirlwind of gray and white, the sounds of struggle muffled by the thick, freezing air. The lantern was knocked over, and for a moment, the spilled oil flared up, a bright, angry orange. I recoiled from the flame. It was an insult, a violation of the dark. I stepped on the fire, my wide, cold foot smothering the light instantly. In the sudden darkness, the audit continued. I found Henderson cowering behind his desk. He was sobbing, his face a mask of snot and tears. "Arthur? Is that you, please, Arthur? We were friends. I gave your kid that summer job at the park." I didn't remember a kid. I didn't remember a park. I only remembered the shed, the unpermitted shed, the violation of the code. I leaned over the desk. My face was inches from his. I could see the reflection of my own milky eyes in his glasses. "The permit," I hissed. The word was a wet, clicking rasp, barely recognizable as human speech. The permit was denied. I didn't kill him quickly. I wanted to feel the heat leave him piece by piece. I started with his feet. Then his hands my touch, turning his flesh to stone. He watched, paralyzed by the local anesthesia of my touch, as his own body became a part of the winter. When I was done, Henderson was a statue of ice, his mouth frozen in a silent O of realization. The town hall was quiet now. The others were feeding, the rhythmic sound of crunching bone the only noise in the room. I stood in the center of the carnage, feeling the balance of the world shift. Lyons was almost entirely silent. Now the heat was almost gone. But then I felt it, a vibration, not from the river, not from the storm. A radio on the desk, a small, battery-powered transistor radio, was crackling with static. Through the white noise, a voice was trying to break through. Repeat. "This is Boulder Emergency Dispatch. Is anyone receiving? Lyons, do you copy? We have reports of a massive thermal anomaly. We are sending a specialized unit. Blackwood Task Force is en route. Stay in your homes. Do not go outside." I walked over to the radio. I picked it up, the plastic brittle in my cold grip. "Blackwood," I whispered. The name meant nothing to me, but the vibration of the voice. It was warm. It was full of life, full of intent. It was a new variable. I crushed the radio in my hand. I looked at my kin. They had finished. They were looking at me, their heads tilted in unison. They had heard the voice too. The audit wasn't over. It was expanding. We left the town hall and stepped back into the blizzard. The wind was picking up, the snow turning into a blinding wall of needles. But we didn't care. We knew where the Blackwood Task Force would come from. There was only one road left that wasn't completely buried. The canyon road where the north-sensed Vrain, cut through the rock, we would meet them there. As we marched through the ruins of Lyons, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. My hunger was growing again, but it was a different kind of hunger. It was a hunger for the challenge, for the heat that fought back. The north at Vrain Hunger was no longer just a town secret. It was a contagion. And as the first light of a gray, sunless dawn began to filter through the clouds, I knew that the world would never be warm again. We reached the canyon entrance. The rock walls towered above us, coated in thick sheets of ice. We climbed, our many-jointed limbs finding purchase in the frozen granite. We took our positions on the ledges, becoming part of the stone, part of the ice. We waited, and then far off in the distance I saw it, a light. Not the pale, ghostly light of the drifters, but a harsh, artificial light. A searchlight cutting through the snow. The Blackwood Task Force. They were coming with their heaters, their guns, their arrogance. They were coming to bring the sun back to Lyons. I clicked my jaw, a sound that was echoed by 60 others along the canyon walls. Let them come, I thought. The northest rain is waiting, and it is very is waiting. And it is very hungry. The searchlight grew brighter. I could hear the rumble of heavy engines, armored vehicles, designed for polar conditions. They were moving slowly, cautiously, their tracks grinding against the frozen asphalt. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer the hands of an engineer. They were the tools of a predator. The first vehicle entered the canyon. It was a massive, black-clad transport, bristling with sensors and thermal cameras. I could see the heat signatures of the men inside, bright, pulsing blobs of red. There were 6 of them in the first vehicle, 6 violations. I waited until the second vehicle entered the kill zone. Then I let go of the ledge. I didn't fall. I drifted. The wind caught my translucent skin, acting like a sail, guiding me down toward the roof of the transport. I landed with a soft thud, my claws digging into the reinforced steel. Inside, I heard a muffled shout. What was that? Sensor hit on the roof. I didn't wait for them to react. I found the air intake for the cabin. I leaned down and began to exhale. My breath wasn't air. It was a concentrated mist of gray ichor and absolute zero. It flowed into the intake, drawn into the lungs of the men inside. The screaming started almost instantly. It was a wet, gurgling sound as their lungs froze from the inside out, their warm blood turning to slush in their veins. The vehicle swerved, its tracks losing grip on the ice, and slammed into the canyon wall. I jumped off as the second vehicle came to a screeching halt. The doors flew open, and men in high-tech thermal suits stepped out, brandishing flamethrowers. Contact! Target is on the roof of Lead 1. The first gout of flame erupted from the nozzle. It was a roar of orange and yellow, a violent intrusion of heat. I felt a surge of genuine anger. The flame didn't just hurt. It was a blasphemy. It was a lie told to the universe. I didn't retreat. I lunged. The fire hit me full in the chest. My skin blackened, the gray ichor inside me boiling. But I didn't stop. I moved through the fire, my body a blur of charred gray and white. I reached the man with the flamethrower before he could turn the stream. I didn't kill him. I grabbed the fuel tank on his back and squeezed. The tank buckled. The pressurized napalms sprayed out, but I didn't let it ignite. I smothered the pilot light with my bare hand, the metal melting against my palm. The man stared at me through his reinforced visor. I could see his eyes, blue, wide, and full of a terrifying realization. He wasn't looking at a monster, he was looking at the future. I leaned in, my face pressing against his visor. The cold from my skin began to crack the polycarbonate glass. The audit, I rasped, the word vibrating through his helmet, is non-negotiable. The glass shattered. I didn't drink his blood. I didn't need to. I just let the cold of the canyon flow into him. I watched as the red glow of his thermal suit faded, the internal heaters failing as the gray ichor clogged the circuits. He slumped to the ground, another statue for the collection. The other men were firing now, their rifles spitting tracers that lit up the snow like fireflies. My kin were dropping from the walls, a rain of pale death. The canyon was filled with the sounds of the audit, the clatter of gunfire, the shriek of tearing metal, and the rhythmic, wet clicking of the drifters. It wasn't a battle, it was a correction. As the last of the Blackwood task force fell, the blizzard seemed to redouble its efforts. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the scent of ozone and frozen blood. I stood over the wreckage of the transport. The searchlight was still on, its beam pointing aimlessly into the sky. I walked over to it and smashed the lens. The dark returned, the beautiful, perfect dark. I looked back toward Lyons. The town was gone. The task force was gone. The world was shrinking, the horizon closing in as the ice thickened. I felt a tug in my mind. A call from the deep, the North St. Vrain was moving. It was flowing down the canyon, toward the plains, toward the cities of the Front Range Longmont, Boulder, Denver. They were all warm. They were all full of noise. They were all violations. I turned and began to walk. My kin followed, a silent, pale army moving through the whiteout. We weren't just the hunters of Lyons anymore. We were the winter itself, and we had only just begun to eat as we moved. I felt the last of Arthur slip away. The memories of sheds and permits, of heat and light, were nothing but echoes in a frozen cave. There was only the hunger, there was only the click, and the snow fell and fell and fell, burying the world in a cold white peace that would never, ever end. The silence that followed the smashing of the searchlight was not a vacuum. It was a heavy, pressurized thing, like the weight of 1,000 fathoms of black water. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal, as the engines of the Blackwood transport succumbed to the encroaching frost. I stood atop the lead vehicle, my many-jointed limbs clicking rhythmically against the reinforced steel, a sound that felt more like a heartbeat than anything I had ever possessed in my former life. Beside the vehicle, one of the task force members was still twitching. He was encased in his high-tech suit, a marvel of human engineering, designed to repel the very essence of the mountain. I hopped down, my landing silent, my feet, now elongated, translucent talons, sinking inches into the drifts. I knelt beside him. The suit's internal life support system was still humming, a desperate, pathetic whirring sound. A small digital display on his wrist flickered. Internal temp 98.6F, warning, external temp critical. I placed a finger on the display. The plastic didn't just crack, it surrendered. The liquid crystal bled out, freezing into a jagged black smear. I could feel the heat pulsing inside the suit, a stubborn, offensive vibration. It felt like a fly buzzing against a window pane, a frantic, useless energy. I began to peel the suit open. I didn't use my strength, though I had plenty. I used the cold. I let the gray ichor in my fingertips seep into the seams of the pressurized fabric. The material became brittle, turning from high tensile polymer to something as fragile as dried leaves. With a sharp snap, the chest plate gave way. The man inside was young. His skin was flushed, sweating, a biological waste of moisture. When the air hit him, his sweat turned instantly to a layer of white rime. He tried to scream, but his throat was already crystallizing. I watched with a clinical fascination as the heat fled his chest, rising in a faint, ghostly steam that the wind whipped away. This was the audit in its purest form. The ledger of his life was being balanced. Every calorie he had consumed, every watt of energy his suit had drained from the grid to keep his blood liquid, was being reclaimed by the North St. Vrain. I reached into the cavity of his chest, not to tear, but to touch my hand. Colder than the vacuum of space brushed against his heart. For one glorious second I felt the rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. And then with a touch of my thumb I stilled it. The muscle didn't stop. It seized. The blood inside, turning to a slush of ruby ice. The hum of the suit died. The ledger was closed. I looked up. My kin were busy. They were like pale spiders amongst the wreckage, weaving a web of frost over the fallen. One of them, a creature that might have been a librarian once, given the way it tilted its head, was systematically dismantling the second transport's communications array. It wasn't just breaking it, it was inverting it. It was breathing into the wires, its gray mist turning the copper into something non-conductive, something that would only broadcast the sound of the wind. The Blackwood Task Force had been a vanguard. They represented the peak of human resistance, the height of their fiery arrogance, and they had been snuffed out like candles in a gale. I felt the norths of rain stir behind us. The river was no longer a flow of water. It was a slurry of ancient, jagged intent. It was rising, spilling over its banks, the ice sheets grinding against one another with the sound of tectonic plates shifting. It wanted the plains. It wanted the flat, soft lands where the humans huddled in their millions, thinking their furnaces and their insulation could protect them. "Move!" I hissed. The word was a vibration that traveled through the ice rather than the air. My kin responded instantly. We turned away from the canyon, away from the graveyard of steel and flesh, and began the descent. The transition from the mountains to the foothills was a sensory shift. In the canyon, the cold was sharp, vertical, and jagged. As we moved toward the edge of the range, the air became denser, heavier with the moisture of the lowlands. To a human, it might have felt slightly warmer. To me, it felt like a thickening of the medium. The heat signatures of the world below began to bleed through the horizon, a dull orange smear against the gray sky. Longmont, Boulder, the vast sprawling grid of the Denver metro area. From this height, they looked like a rash on the skin of the earth, a fever. We moved with a terrifying fluidity. We didn't walk. We glided in long, low bounds, our claws finding purchase on the frozen scrub oak and the granite outcrops. The blizzard followed us, a loyal hound. We were the center of the storm, the eye of the absolute zero. As we reached the mouth of the canyon, where the St. Vrain spills out onto the flats near Lyons Edge, I saw the first of the civilian outposts. It was a roadblock, concrete barriers, a portable generator, and a small plywood shack where two men sat, huddled over a space heater. They were drinking coffee. The scent of it, burnt, acidic, and cloyingly warm, reached me from 100 yards away. It was an insult. I signaled to the drifters. We split into two flanks, disappearing into the whiteout. I approached the shack from the rear. The generator was chugging, a rhythmic chug-a-chug-a-chug that sent puffs of blue smoke into the air. I placed my hand on the engine block. The heat was scorching, a violent vibration that made my skin hiss. I didn't pull away. I gripped the metal, letting the gray ichor flow from my palms. The engine didn't seize, it calcified. The oil turned to wax, the pistons fused to the cylinders, and the heat was sucked into my arm, neutralized by the infinite sink of my core. The generator died with a pathetic cough. Inside the shack, the light flickered and went out. "Damn it, Miller! The Jenny kicked!" a voice shouted. "I told you the fuel was gelling. Go out and prime it." The door of the shack creaked open. A man stepped out, wrapped in a heavy parka, a flashlight in his hand. The beam cut through the snow, searching for the generator. I stood right in front of him. But I didn't move. I was a statue of gray and white, indistinguishable from the storm. He panted his breath, a thick cloud of steam. He walked toward me, his boots crunching on the ice. He was 3 feet away when he saw me. Or rather, when he realized the snowdrift had eyes. His flashlight dropped into the snow, the beam pointing upward, illuminating the underside of my jaw. I saw the pupils of his eyes dilate until the iris was nothing but a thin rim of blue. He didn't scream. The cold had already settled in his lungs, making his breath come in short, shallow hitches. "The permit," I whispered, leaning down so my face was inches from his. Dot was for a shed, not for a world. I didn't kill him with my claws. I simply breathed on him. The mist of my breath entered his open mouth. I watched the process with a sense of profound peace. The heat in his throat vanished. The moisture on his tongue turned to needles. His eyes filmed over with a milky white cataract of frost. He stood there, perfectly preserved, a century of ice guarding a road that no longer led anywhere. The second man, Miller, came to the door. "Jim, you got it yet?" He didn't get an answer. He didn't see me either. He only saw the silhouette of his friend standing by the generator. "Jim, quit messing around. It's freezing in here." Miller stepped out, and a drifter, the one who had been the librarian, dropped from the roof of the shack. It didn't land on him. It passed through him like a shadow. Miller fell without a sound, his body turning to stone before he hit the ground. We didn't linger. The roadblock was cleared. The path to the plains was open. As we marched onto the flatlands, the scale of the task became apparent. The wind here was different. It didn't howl through rock. It swept across the open spaces, picking up the dry, powdery snow of the prairies and turning it into a blinding shroud. I could feel the vibrations of the cities now. It wasn't just heat, it was noise. The hum of the power grid, the distant roar of snowplows, the frantic chatter of radio waves. It was a cacophony of existence, a frantic, vibrating protest against the encroaching silence. We reached the outskirts of Hygiene, a small community between Lyons and Longmont. Here, the houses were spaced out, surrounded by dormant fields and frozen irrigation ditches. I stopped at the edge of a farmhouse. Inside, I could see the glow of a fireplace. A family, a man, a woman, 2 children, were huddled in the living room. They had boarded up the windows, but the heat was still leaking out through the cracks in the door, through the chimney, through the very pores of the wood. To my eyes, the house looked like a bleeding wound. The heat was a bright, angry red, pulsing into the gray-blue of the night. It was an inefficiency, a violation of the balance. I looked at my kin. They were spread out across the fields. Dozens of pale shapes moving through the dark. They were waiting for my lead. I walked toward the house. My feet didn't make a sound on the porch. I reached out and touched the siding. The wood was warm, too warm. It felt like a feverish skin. I didn't break the door down. I simply leaned my forehead against it. I began to draw. I wasn't taking their lives, not yet. I was taking their environment. I sucked the heat out of the walls. I drew the warmth from the air inside, pulling it through the wood and into my own hollow frame. Inside, I heard the man speak. "Is it just me? Or did the furnace just quit?" "Check the thermostat, honey," the woman said. Her voice was trembling. It's dropping fast. It says it's 40 degrees in here." "That's impossible. The fire is roaring." I closed my eyes and focused on the fire. It was a small, contained sun, a violent chemical reaction. I reached out with my mind, connecting with the vibrations of the flames. I slowed them down. I reduced the kinetic energy of the atoms, turning the bright orange glow into a dull, guttering purple, and then, finally, into black ash. The screaming started then, not because of me, but because of the sudden, absolute loss of hope. The darkness in the house was now total. I didn't enter. There was no need. The audit was self-executing. We moved on, house by house, farm by farm. Behind us, the lights of Hygiene went out one by one. The red bleeds of heat were replaced by the cool, stable gray of equilibrium. The north, its Vrain, was following us, its frozen fingers reaching into the irrigation ditches, turning the veins of the farmland into arteries of ice. The river was expanding, its hunger growing as it tasted the vastness of the plains. By the time we reached the limits of Longmont, the sun should have been rising. But there was no sun. The sky was a solid, leaden ceiling, the atmosphere so thick with ice crystals that the light was diffused into a dim, sourceless luminescence. The city was waiting. I could see the skyscrapers of Denver in the far distance, tiny needles of heat poking through the horizon. They were so bright they hurt my eyes. But closer, Longmont was a sprawling mess of violations. Street lights, traffic signals, hospital generators, thousands of homes. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt since the town hall. It wasn't hunger, it was ambition. The Blackwood Task Force had mentioned a specialized unit. They would be coming. They would bring more fire, more light, more noise. I clicked my jaw. The sound was picked up by the drifters, a wave of clicking that echoed off the frozen warehouses and suburban fences. We weren't just a local phenomenon anymore. We were a front, a glacial wall moving against the world of men. I stepped onto the asphalt of Main Street. The road was buried under 3 feet of snow, but I could feel the heat of the sewers beneath it, the warm, rotting breath of the city's underbelly. I reached down and plunged my claws into the ground, tearing through the frozen earth until I hit the main water line. I didn't break it. I breathed into it. The water inside didn't just freeze. It expanded with a violent, explosive force. I felt the vibration travel for miles. The sound of pipes bursting in 1,000 basements. The lifeblood of the city turning to jagged shards. "The audit," I whispered to the empty street, "has reached the metropolitan phase." In the distance, a siren began to wail. It was a thin, lonely sound. a plea for help that would never come. I turned toward the sound, my kin flowing around me like a tide of pale ink. The city of Longmont was about to become very, very quiet, and I was looking forward to the silence. The siren was a rhythmic laceration of the quiet I was building. It belonged to a heavy-duty emergency vehicle, an ambulance or a fire truck, struggling through the drifts a few blocks east. To my ears, the sound was more than audio. It was a jagged, oscillating heat signature, a desperate pulse of red energy trying to push back the encroaching gray. I turned my head, the frozen vertebrae in my neck clicking like a tally counter. The drifters moved with me, their forms flickering in and out of visibility against the swirling whiteout. They didn't walk so much as they drifted, their feet skimming the surface of the snow, their elongated limbs trailing behind them like the tattered ribbons of a funeral shroud. We reached the intersection of Main and 3rd. The storefronts here were dark, their plate glass windows frosted over from the inside as the trapped humidity of human commerce crystallized against the glass. I could see the shapes of mannequins in a clothing boutique, plastic, lifeless things that, for a moment, looked more real than the shivering people I knew were hiding in the basements beneath my feet. The vehicle finally came into view. It wasn't a standard emergency unit. It was a matte black armored transport, its tires wrapped in heavy chains that ground against the buried asphalt with a screech of tortured metal. Mounted on its roof was a high-intensity thermal floodlight. The beam swung toward us. It was a violent intrusion. The light hit me, and for a second I felt the repulsive sting of artificial photons. It wasn't warm, not truly, but it represented the intent of warmth, the arrogance of illumination. "Target sighted!" A voice crackled over a loudspeaker, distorted by the wind. "Non-biological. Entity at 12 o'clock. Deploy the suppression lattice." I didn't flinch. I watched as the rear doors of the transport swung open. 4 figures stepped out. They were encased in bulky, pressurized suits. Not the thin fabric of the local police, but something industrial, something designed for extreme environments. They carried canisters on their backs, connected by reinforced hoses to wide-nozzled projectors. The Blackwood Task Force. They hadn't sent soldiers. They had sent exterminators. "You are in violation of the Public Safety Act." The loudspeaker boomed, the voice hollow and metallic. "Cease all atmospheric manipulation and surrender, or we will initiate thermal purging." I tilted my head, looking at the lead suit. I didn't see a human. I saw a pressurized pocket of heat, a frantic, vibrating cluster of molecules, desperately trying to maintain a temperature of 98. 6 degrees in a world that was rapidly approaching 0. "The act," I whispered, my voice carried by the wind like the grinding of glaciers, "has been amended. Section 4, paragraph 12. All thermal surplus is to be surrendered to the sink." They didn't hear me, or perhaps they chose not to. The lead technician raised his projector. "Commence purge." A roar erupted from the nozzles. Not bullets, but liquid fire, napalm, or some high-energy chemical accelerant. A gout of brilliant orange-white flame arched through the air, a screaming serpent of heat intended to incinerate the snowdrift that stood in their path. I didn't move. I didn't need to. As the fire approached, I opened my pores. I didn't just absorb the heat, I demanded it. The flames didn't splash against me. They were sucked into the vacuum of my presence. The orange glow vanished into the gray ichor of my skin, neutralized instantly by the infinite, hungry void within. The technicians froze. The fire continued to pour from their nozzles, but it was being extinguished the moment it left the projectors, turning into harmless, soot-colored flakes that drifted to the ground like black snow. "Pressure is dropping," one of them shouted, his voice rising in a frantic register. "The fuel is. It's losing its flash point. It's turning to slush in the lines." I stepped forward, the asphalt beneath my feet cracked, the frost heaving the road upward in jagged plates. "Your equipment is inefficient," I said, my voice vibrating in the very marrow of their bones. "You are burning fuel to create heat, yet the heat provides no work. It is a closed loop of waste." I reached out and grasped the nozzle of the lead technician's projector. The metal was white-hot, glowing with the chemical fire within. I squeezed. The gray ichor flowed from my fingertips. Coating the metal, I watched the glow die. I watched the molecular structure of the alloy realign, turning from a ductile, heat-resistant steel into something brittle and crystalline. The projector shattered in his hands like a piece of frozen porcelain. The man stumbled back, his gloved hands fumbling at the seals of his suit. I could smell his fear now, a sharp, acrid scent that cut through the ozone. It was the smell of a machine realizing its gears were stripped. The suit, I noted, leaning closer. It is a marvel of insulation. It keeps the heat in. It denies the environment its due. I tapped the chest plate of his suit. A small spiderweb crack appeared in the reinforced polymer. The audit requires a sample, I said. I didn't break the suit. I simply accelerated the entropy of the seals. The rubber gaskets turned to dust. The pressurized oxygen inside hissed out, a tiny, pathetic whistle of warmth. The man inside gasped. I watched through the gold-tinted visor as his breath began to fog the glass. Not a gentle fog, but a thick white rime of frost that grew from the edges of the mask inward. He clawed at his throat, his movements becoming sluggish as the cold reached his core. Behind me, the drifters moved in on the other three. They didn't use fire or claws. They simply stood near the technicians, their presence a literal drain on the reality of the space. The lights on the armored transport flickered and died. The engine, a massive diesel beast, groaned and seized as the oil in its crankcase turned to a solid block of amber. One of the drifters, the one that had once been a construction foreman, placed its long, pale hands on the roof of the vehicle. I watched as the steel began to frost, the heavy armor plating buckling inward as the air inside the cabin contracted, creating a vacuum that crushed the frame like a soda can. The screams from inside the transport were muffled, then silenced by the sound of snapping metal. I turned back to the lead technician. He was on his knees now, his suit a useless shell of frozen plastic. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot behind the frosted visor. "Why?" he wheezed, the word barely a vibration. "Because the ledger must balance," I replied. "You have spent too long in the red. The Norths at Vrain is merely the collection agent." I placed my hand over his visor. I didn't crush it. I simply let my cold flow through the glass. I watched his pupils fix and dilate. I watched the moisture in his vitreous humor turn to ice, his vision fracturing into 1,000 jagged shards of white before his brain finally surrendered its last spark of electrical heat. He became a statue, a monument to the failure of technology against the inevitability of the freeze. I looked down Main Street. The city of Longmont was no longer a grid of light. It was a canyon of shadows, the buildings looming like tombstones in the dim, sourceless light of the storm. But there was still a great deal of work to do. To the south, the glow of the Longmont power plant pulsed against the clouds. It was a massive coal-fired heart, pumping out megawatts of energy, a defiant thrumming that I could feel in the soles of my feet. It was the primary source of the violation. I signaled to the drifters. "The heart," I whispered. "We must still the heart." We moved as a single shadow, flowing south. As we passed the residential neighborhoods, I saw the faces behind the windows, pale, terrified ghosts watching their world turn to glass. They were burning furniture. Now I could smell the treated wood and the upholstery foam. It was a toxic, desperate heat, a final, futile protest. The river followed us. The North St. Vrain was no longer a stream. It had become a localized glacier, a tongue of ice that pushed through the streets, lifting cars and crushing fences, its frozen mass expanding with every calorie we harvested. We reached the perimeter of the power plant. It was a fortress of concrete and steel, surrounded by high-tension wires that hummed with a frantic electric vibration. The air here was dry and tasted of copper. A searchlight swept across us, but it was dim, the bulb struggling to maintain its filament's temperature against the absolute drain of our presence. "Halt!" a voice cried from a guard tower. "This is a restricted zone. Use of deadly force is authorized." A machine gun opened up. The tracers were bright red streaks in the dark, cutting through the snow. They hit the drifters, but the lead didn't tear flesh. It simply passed through the pale, nebulous forms, the kinetic energy of the bullets being absorbed and converted into harmless, cooling vibrations. The drifter that had been the librarian reached the base of the tower. It didn't climb, it simply touched the steel supports. The metal didn't break, it fatigued. In seconds, the structural integrity of the steel was gone, the atoms losing their grip on one another as the heat that held them in their lattice was withdrawn. The tower groaned and folded, collapsing into with the sound of 1,000 breaking bells. I walked toward the main turbine hall. The vibration here was immense. A deep subsonic roar that made my gray ichor thrum in sympathy. This was the source of the noise. This was the engine of the waste. I placed my palms against the corrugated steel of the outer wall. It was hot, gloriously, offensively hot. I closed my eyes and let the hunger take hold. This wasn't a farmhouse. This wasn't a generator. This was a sun. He began to draw. The roar of the turbines changed pitch. The steady 60 Hz hum began to wobble, dropping to a low guttural moan. Inside, I could hear the alarm starting, the frantic, high-pitched wail of sensors detecting a catastrophic loss of thermal pressure. 3. Someone screamed inside. We're losing the steam. The pressure is vanishing. It's not a leak, it's just gone. I pushed my hands through the steel, the metal turning to brittle flakes beneath my touch. I stepped into the hall. The heat was a physical weight. Huge pipes, wrapped in white insulation, crisscrossed the ceiling, the massive turbines, the size of houses, spun with a blur of motion. Men were running across the catwalks, their faces slick with sweat, their eyes wide with the terror of a machine that had stopped obeying the laws of physics. The auditor is here, I said, my voice echoing in the vast, hollow space. I walked toward the central boiler. It was a towering monolith of fire and water, a controlled explosion that had been burning for decades. I reached out and laid my hands on the primary steam line. The heat was a violent, screaming thing. It tried to burn me. It tried to push me back, but I was a hole in the universe. I was the end of all things. I drank. I felt the steam inside the pipe collapse. It didn't turn to water. It turned to ice instantly, the phase shift so violent that the reinforced steel pipe shivered and cracked. The ice inside didn't stop there. It raced back toward the boiler, a spear of absolute zero thrust into the heart of the fire. The boiler didn't explode. It imploded. The fire inside was snuffed out in a heartbeat. The massive internal pressure, stripped of its heat, vanished, and the atmospheric pressure outside crushed the gargantuan tank like a tin can. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The turbines slowed, their whine descending through the octaves until they were nothing but the sound of heavy metal grinding against heavy metal. The lights in the hall flickered, dimmed to a dull orange, and then died. The men on the catwalks froze. One of them dropped a wrench. It hit the floor with a dull thud, the sound flat and dead in the new cold air. The audit of Longmont, I whispered, the frost already beginning to bloom on the walls of the turbine hall, is complete. We shall move to the transmission lines. I looked out through the jagged hole I had made in the wall. To the south, the horizon was still bright. Denver was a sprawling golden cancer on the dark skin of the world. The hunger in my core flared. It wasn't just a town anymore. It wasn't just a river. It was a world of waste. And I was the only one who could bring it into balance. I stepped out of the power plant and back into the storm. The north of Vrain was waiting for me, its icy waters. Now a solid road of white, leading straight toward the heart of the city. The silence was spreading, and it was beautiful. The silence in the turbine hall was not merely an absence of noise. It was a physical weight, a pressurized void that pushed against the eardrums of the survivors. The air, once thick with the smell of scorched ozone and lubricating oil, now carried the sterile, scentless tang of the upper atmosphere. I looked at the men on the catwalks. They were statues of flesh, their sweat-dampened clothes already stiffening into frozen carapaces. One man, a senior engineer, by the look of his graying beard and the heavy ring of keys at his hip, tried to speak. His jaw moved, but the hinges of his mandible were locked by the sudden, crystalline rigidity of his synovial fluid. A small puff of white vapor escaped his lips, the very last of his internal fires, and then he too became part of the architecture of the freeze. "Leave the husks," I commanded. My voice didn't travel through the air. It vibrated through the frost that now coated every surface, a resonance that bypassed ears and spoke directly to the marrow. There is no more profit to be found in the spent. The drifters drifted toward me, their forms more defined now. The librarian's translucent fingers were tipped with a faint blue luminescence, the stolen glow of 1,000 light bulbs. The foreman's chest was a hollow cavity of swirling sleet. They were gorged on the plant's output, yet their hunger remained, a fundamental law of their new existence. To have is to want, to consume is to create a larger void. We exited through the collapsed wall. Outside, the North St. Vrain had already claimed the parking lot. The river was no longer a fluid thing. It was a jagged, tectonic upheaval of white and translucent blue, grinding the asphalt into fine black dust. It moved with us, a loyal hound of ice, its frozen tongue licking the foundations of the nearby substations. The transmission lines loomed ahead. They were the great arterial pathways of the violation. Massive steel towers that marched across the plains, carrying the lifeblood of the civilization toward the maw of the city. In the dark they hummed, a low, frantic thrumming as the grid attempted to compensate for the sudden death of the Longmont plant. The wires were under immense tension, vibrating with the desperate flow of electrons being diverted from plants further south, from the wind farms on the eastern plains, from the great dams in the mountains. "The veins are full," I whispered. I approached the first tower. It was a skeletal giant, its lattice of galvanized steel at center-head against the starless, snow-choked sky. I could feel the heat of the electricity passing overhead, a searing, invisible river of fire that defied the natural order. It was an insult to the equilibrium. I didn't touch the tower. I didn't need to. I simply opened the pores of my being and invited the current to find its ground through me. The effect was instantaneous. The high-tension wires didn't just snap. They sublimated. The massive surge of energy, finding a sudden, perfect sink in my cold, caused the copper and aluminum to flash into a violet vapor. The sky above us erupted in a silent, blinding aurora, a curtain of ghost light that rippled from horizon to horizon as the grid's protection systems failed to catch the drain. The tower itself groaned, deprived of the heat that kept its molecular structure resilient. The cold-rolled steel became as brittle as sugar glass. The North St. Vrain, sensing the opening, sent a surge of ice upward, wrapping around the legs of the tower like a rising tide. The steel shattered with a sound like a gunshot, and the giant toppled, its fall cushioned by the thickening snow. We followed the line of towers south. As we moved, the world behind us fell into a true dark. The distant clusters of streetlights in the suburbs, Niwot, Gunbarrel, Erie, winked out in a cascading failure. One moment they were amber jewels on a velvet cloth. The next, they were simply gone, swallowed by the expanding shadow of our passage. We reached a residential development on the outskirts of the city. Here, the houses were clustered together in a mockery of community, their thin walls stuffed with fiberglass insulation that promised a warmth it could not truly provide. I stopped in front of a house at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was a smart home, its windows glowing with the soft blue light of LED displays. Inside, I could see a family. They were huddled in the living room, wrapped in electric blankets that were now useless things. The father was frantically poking at a tablet, his face illuminated by the dying glow of the battery. The mother was clutching two small children, their breath coming in short, panicked clouds. They had a fireplace, but they weren't using it. They had relied on the invisible, distant fire of the grid, and now that it had been reclaimed, they were paralyzed by the impossibility of their predicament. I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned, the moisture in the planks freezing and expanding, splitting the grain, with a series of sharp, rhythmic cracks. The drifter that had been a construction foreman moved toward the side of the house where the gas meter was located. It placed a pale, elongated hand on the regulator. I watched as the metal turned gray-white with rime. Inside the pipes, the pressurized natural gas. The ancient, trapped heat of a million prehistoric summers. Felt the call of the auditor. It didn't burn. It simply condensed, turning from a gas to a liquid, then to a solid, clogging the lines with a slush of frozen methane. The furnace in the basement, which had been trying to kick over, gave a final wheezing metallic rattle and died. I walked to the front door. I didn't turn the handle. I simply leaned my forehead against the wood. I could hear their heartbeats. They were fast, fluttering things, like the wings of trapped birds. Each beat was a tiny explosion of chemical energy, a microdose of heat produced by the oxidation of glucose. It was a beautiful, intricate process, and it was a debt that had been overdue for a lifetime. "The audit is personal," I murmured to the wood. I reached out and touched the doorbell. The plastic button shattered. I pushed my hand through the door, the solid oak turning to a flurry of frozen splinters. The man in the living room stood up, dropping his tablet. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown wide in the dim light. He looked at me, not at a man, but at the tall, gray shape of the end of the world. "Please," he rasped. "We have children. We have. We have a generator in the garage. Take it. Just take it." "I have already taken the generator," I said, my voice a cold wind in the hallway. "And I have taken the gas. I have taken the light. But the ledger remains unbalanced. You have lived in a surplus of warmth for 34 years. You have exhaled carbon and heat into a world that was meant to be still." I moved into the room. The air temperature dropped 40 degrees in a single heartbeat. The frost didn't crawl across the walls. It leapt, covering the family photos, the television, the plush sofa in a thick white fur of ice. The children began to cry, but the sound was thin and brittle, the moisture in their throats freezing before the sound could fully form. I didn't touch them with violence. I approached the father and placed my hand over his heart. He didn't scream, he couldn't. He simply stiffened as I began to withdraw the thermal debt. I felt the heat of his blood, the 98.6 degrees of his vanity, flowing into my palm. It was a heady, intoxicating sensation. The feeling of a hole being filled. His skin turned the color of a winter sky at dusk. His eyes, once bright with terror, became dull and clouded, the lenses freezing into milky marbles. I felt his heart slow, the muscle laboring against the thickening sludge of his blood, until finally it gave one last, sluggish thump and stopped. He remained standing, a pillar of frost in his own living room. I turned to the mother. She was staring at her husband, her mouth open in a silent wail. I reached for her, but then I stopped. The drifter, the librarian, was standing by the bookshelf in the corner. It was running its fingers over the spines of the books. As it touched them, the ink on the pages didn't just fade. It drifted off the paper as a fine, black soot, the information itself being erased as the energy required to hold the symbols in place was harvested. "The children," the librarian whispered, its voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "They have so much potential, so much future heat." "No," I said. "The audit must be precise. We do not take what is not owed. The young have not yet accumulated the debt of the elders. They are the seeds of the next cycle." I looked at the two children. They were shivering violently. The body's last desperate attempt to generate kinetic heat. "Leave them the scraps," I commanded. We moved to the highway. The migration has begun, and the road is a river of wasted motion. We left the house, leaving the door wide to the screaming wind. Behind us, the mother and her children were huddling around the frozen statue of the father, seeking a warmth that was no longer there. Outside, the North St. Vrain had grown. It was now a wall of ice 20 feet high, moving down the center of the suburban street, crushing the parked subs and minivans beneath its weight. It wasn't just following the geography anymore. It was creating its own. It was a glacier of the Anthropocene, a white erasure of everything man had built. We reached the embankment of I-25. The scene was a vision of hell frozen over. Thousands of cars were stalled in the snow, a glittering snake of metal that stretched as far as the eye could see. The headlights were dimming, the batteries failing in the extreme cold. People were abandoning their vehicles, attempting to walk toward the glow of Denver, their silhouettes small and pathetic against the vast, white expanse of the plains. The heat coming off the highway was immense. Thousands of engines, still warm from their final revolutions, thousands of human bodies, radiating panic. The friction of tires on pavement. It was a buffet of waste. I stood on the overpass, looking down at the gridlock. "Begin the collection," I said. The drifters descended like pale kites. They didn't go for the people first, they went for the machines. I watched as a drifter landed on the hood of a semi-truck. It reached into the engine block. The heat of the massive diesel engine was sucked out in a visible shimmer of distorted air. The metal of the block contracted so quickly that it shattered, the pistons seizing with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. The driver scrambled out of the cab, his heavy coat useless against the localized absolute zero. He took 3 steps before his boots froze to the asphalt. He pulled, trying to free himself, but the rubber soles had bonded to the road on a molecular level. He fell forward, his hands hitting the ground, and he stayed there, a bridge of frozen flesh. I walked along the roof of a line of stalled sedans. Beneath my feet, I could feel the life inside. A young couple in a Honda clutching each other, an elderly woman in a Buick talking to a cat that was already dead in her lap, a businessman in an Audi, frantically trying to light a cigar with a silver lighter that refused to spark. I reached down and touched the roof of the Audi. The flame in the lighter didn't just go out. The heat of the spark was pulled back into the flint. The man looked up, his eyes meeting mine through the sunroof. He saw the gray, eyeless void of my face, and he understood. He didn't plead. He simply closed his eyes and waited for the balance to be struck. I took it all. I took the heat of the engine, the heat of the heater core, the heat of his expensive wool suit, and finally, the heat of his breath. As I moved down the line, the North St. Vrain followed. It climbed the embankment and began to flow down the interstate, a slow-moving, grinding machine of ice. It swallowed the cars, tilting them on their sides, crushing them into the median, entombing the occupants in a permanent crystal silence. To the south, the skyline of Denver was changing. The great skyscrapers, usually vibrant with the glow of a million lights, were beginning to flicker. The cash register building, the Wells Fargo Tower, the spire of the Four Seasons, one by one, their crowns went dark. The city was sensing the approach of the auditor. The emergency sirens were wailing now, a long, mournful cry that echoed off the mountains to the west. But the sirens required power, and power was a commodity that was rapidly being delisted. The sound began to droop, the pitch falling lower and lower until it was a guttural growl, then a click, then nothing. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of 1 billion extinguished fires. I looked at my hands. They were no longer gray. They were a deep, bruised purple, pulsing with the stolen warmth of Longmont and the highway. I felt strong. I felt heavy. I felt like the center of gravity for the entire world. "The heart of the state," I whispered, looking toward the dark silhouette of the Capitol dome. "The ledger there must be massive. The waste of governance, the heat of ambition. It will be a feast." We moved forward, a phalanx of cold. The North Vrain surged behind us, its ice now streaked with the colors of the things it had consumed, the red of taillights, the blue of police cruisers, the dull gray of the asphalt. We were no longer a small band of ghosts. We were a front. We were the inevitable conclusion of a world that had forgotten the cost of the sun. As we crossed the border into the city limits, a military Humvee roared toward us, its tires chained, its roof-mounted machine gun chattering. The bullets whined through the air, but as they entered the sphere of our influence, their kinetic energy was stripped away. They didn't hit us. They simply lost their momentum and fell to the snow, cold and inert like heavy raindrops. The Humvee tried to swerve, but the ice of the North St. Vrain was already beneath its wheels. The vehicle spun, its engine dying as we passed, and it was quickly overtaken by the rising tide of the glacier. I didn't look back. I was looking at the Denver skyline. There was one building that was still bright, a hospital. Its emergency generators were roaring, a defiant island of heat in the encroaching dark. I could see the steam rising from its roof vents, a white flag of surrender that it didn't yet know it was waving. "The healers," I said, a faint, bitter smile touching the place where my mouth had once been. "They fight so hard to keep the cold at bay. They use so much energy to delay the inevitable." I pointed a long, frost-rimed finger toward the hospital. "We shall start there. We shall show them that there is no cure for the audit." We drifted off the highway and into the streets of the city, the silence of our footsteps muffled by the 3 feet of snow that had fallen in the last hour. The buildings loomed over us like the ribs of a gargantuan, picked over carcass. The hunger in my chest, which had been a dull ache, was now a roaring furnace of cold. I wanted it all. I wanted every spark, every ember, every calorie. I wanted to turn the mile-high city into a mile-deep tomb of ice. And the north sent Vrain, my cold, white shadow, groaned in agreement as it began to climb the walls of the first skyscraper. The urban canyons of Denver acted as a funnel for the north sent Vrain, the wind. Now a pressurized jet of crystalline needles shrieked between the glass towers, sandblasting the facades until the tempered panes clouded and cracked. The sound was not a whistle, but a low-frequency vibration that rattled the marrow in human bones. A tectonic groan of the earth, reclaiming its equilibrium. As we moved down 17th Street, the Wall Street of the West, the very air seemed to thicken, turning into a translucent soup of nitrogen and dying light. The skyscrapers didn't just stand, they endured. I watched the librarian pause at the base of a bank building. It pressed its palm against the granite. A web of frost, intricate and fractal, raced up the stone, tracing the hidden veins of rebar. The metal inside the concrete shivered, losing its ductility, becoming as brittle as dried pasta. High above, a decorative cornice, deprived of its molecular integrity, simply disintegrated, falling in a silent curtain of dust that never reached the ground, suspended by the sheer density of the frozen air. "The vaults?" the librarian murmured, its voice a dry rasp that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my skull. "The digital ghosts of wealth, all that potential energy, locked in silicon and magnetic tape. It is a hollow heat, but it burns with a frantic artificial light. Consume the records," I commanded. "Leave no debt uncollected." The librarian leaned into the building, its form blurring as it partially phased through the wall. I felt the surge, a sudden, violent drain. Inside the bank's server rooms, the cooling systems would be failing, not because of a lack of power, but because the cold was so absolute that the very concept of cooling became redundant to data. The billions of ones and zeros that define the lives of the city's inhabitants was being sucked dry. The electrons slowed in their circuits. The magnetic alignments on the hard drives flickered and died. The history of greed, the ledgers of labor, all of it was being converted back into the raw, dark currency of the void. I turned my attention to the hospital. It sat like a fortress at the edge of the downtown district, a sprawling complex of brick and glass. The steam I had seen earlier was now a massive, roiling plume, illuminated from below by the flickering amber of the emergency lights. The generators were buried deep in the bowels of the building, churning out a desperate, localized sun. As we approached, the sensory input was overwhelming. The hospital was a riot of wasted motion, the frantic pacing of surgeons, the rhythmic thrum of ventilators, the chemical heat of medicines being synthesized in the pharmacy, the fever dreams of the dying. It was a concentrated pocket of resistance against the second law of thermodynamics. We breached the perimeter. The parking lot was a graveyard of ambulances. Their sirens were still spinning, but the lights were dimming to a dull, bruised purple. The medics had abandoned them, fleeing inside for the warmth of the lobby. I walked past a gurney that had been left near the entrance. A man lay upon it, wrapped in silver thermal blankets. He was shivering so violently that the metal frame of the gurney rattled against the pavement. I reached out and touched the silver foil. The crinkle of the plastic was the loudest thing in the world. The heat trapped beneath the blanket didn't dissipate into the air. It flowed into me. It felt like a drink of molten lead, heavy, searing, and intoxicating. The man's shivering stopped instantly, not because he was warm, but because the kinetic energy required for the muscle spasms had been withdrawn. He became a statue of flesh, his eyes wide, his pupils fixed on the dark sky. The thermal blanket, now drained of its reflective purpose, turned gray and shattered like a sheet of ice. We entered the lobby through the sliding glass doors. They were stuck halfway open, the sensors confused by the lack of thermal signatures. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, sweat, and terror. It was warm, perhaps 60 degrees, but to me it felt like a furnace. The heat was an assault. It pressed against my purple skin, trying to force its way into the vacuum of my being. The lobby was packed. Hundreds of people, patients, staff, and those who had wandered in from the streets, were huddled together. They had stripped the curtains from the windows and the tapestries from the walls to wrap themselves. They were burning furniture in large metal trash cans. The smoke choking the ceiling, the orange light casting long, desperate shadows. At the sight of us, the room went silent. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a forest when the predator enters the clearing. They saw the librarian, a spindly, elongated shadow, drifting toward the records desk. They saw me, the auditor, a towering figure of bruised violet and frost, my presence alone causing the breath to crystallize in their lungs before they could even exhale. A security guard, his uniform damp with sweat, stepped forward. He pulled his sidearm, his hands shaking so badly the barrel of the gun traced erratic circles in the air. "Stay back," he croaked. "This is a sanctuary. We have children here. We have the sick." "The debt does not acknowledge sanctuary," I said. My voice was a low vibration that caused the glass partitions of the reception desk to spiderweb with cracks. "The heat you consume to keep the sick alive is heat stolen from the future. The balance must be struck." He fired. The muzzle flash was a beautiful, brief bloom of orange and yellow. But as the bullet left the barrel, its velocity plummeted. I watched it move through the air, a slow, spinning hunk of lead. I reached out and caught it between my thumb and forefinger. It was hot, a tiny nugget of friction and chemical explosion. I squeezed it, and the heat vanished. The metal turned white with rime and crumbled into a fine, gray powder between my fingers. The guard stared at his hand. The heat of the discharge had been sucked back into the gun, and then into his arm. I watched the frost creep up his sleeve, turning the fabric into a stiff, frozen cast. He dropped the weapon, his fingers snapping off like dry twigs as they hit the floor. He didn't scream. The nerves were frozen before the pain signals could reach his brain. "The triage," I said to the drifters. "Start with the machines, the life support. The artificial breath is the most expensive debt." They moved with the grace of falling snow. I walked toward the elevators. The power was flickering, the lights humming with a dying yellow frequency. I didn't use the buttons. I simply pressed my hand against the steel doors. The metal groaned, the molecular bonds failing. As I withdrew the heat of their forging, the doors buckled and folded inward like wet paper, revealing the dark shaft beyond. I didn't need the car. I drifted upward, my feet never touching the cables. I reached the intensive care unit on the 4th floor. Here, the heat was different. It was concentrated, mechanical, and frantic. The hum of the ventilators was a chorus of stolen time. Each breath forced into a pair of failing lungs was a calorie of energy diverted from the inevitable. I stepped into the ward. A nurse was standing over a central monitor, her face illuminated by the green glow of the heart rates. She looked up, and the terror in her eyes was a feast. It was a sharp, high-energy fear, the kind that burns bright and fast. "Please," she whispered, "the power. The generators are failing. If the heaters go, they all die." "They are already dead," I said, moving toward the first bed. "They are being held in a state of expensive suspension. You are fighting the tide with a spoon." I placed my hand on the ventilator. The machine was warm, its motor whirring. With the effort of pushing air into a comatose body, I felt the heat of the electricity, the heat of the friction, the heat of the very air it was processing. I took it. The motor seized with a metallic shriek. The green line on the monitor didn't flatline. The monitor itself went dark as I drained the capacitors. The patient in the bed, an elderly man with a face like a crumpled map, gasped once. a final, ragged inhalation of freezing air, and then he was still. His skin turned the color of a winter lake, the moisture in his cells turning to needles of ice that punctured his veins from the inside out. The nurse tried to push me away, her small hands hitting my chest. It was like hitting a wall of frozen meat. I felt the warmth of her palms, the frantic beat of her heart through her scrub top. "You have so much," I whispered, looking down at her. "The heat of your compassion. It is a significant waste. I didn't take it all. I left her enough to live, but not enough to care." I watched as the light left her eyes, replaced by a dull, gray apathy. She dropped her hands, her expression becoming as blank as the monitors. She turned away from the dying patients and walked toward the window, her movements slow and mechanical. I moved through the ward, a reaper of entropy. With every machine I touched, the room grew colder. The windows began to frost over from the inside, the humidity of the human breath turning into a thick white fur on the glass. Behind me, the northern rain was rising. I could hear it outside, the sound of the glacier grinding against the brick of the hospital. It was climbing the walls, its icy fingers prying into the mortar, seeking the warmth within. The building groaned, the steel girders in the walls contracting and snapping with sounds like distant artillery. The librarian appeared in the doorway, its arms full of medical charts. As it moved, the paper turned to ash, the ink rising in a black cloud that circled its head like a halo of dead thoughts. "The records of their ailments," the librarian said. "The history of their resistance to the cold. It is a dense text. It will take time to fully audit." "We have all the time the universe has left," I replied. "The sun is a dwindling candle. We are the shadows it casts." I walked to the end of the hall, to the neonatal unit. Through the glass I saw the incubators. They were the brightest spots in the entire building, plastic cocoons of intense artificial warmth. Inside were the infants, the seeds of the next cycle I had spoken of before. I paused. The hunger in me roared. These were the purest sources of heat. Their metabolism was a frantic, high-speed engine, their cells dividing with a kinetic fury that was an affront to the stillness I served. I remembered my own command. "We do not take what is not owed." But the debt of the city was so large. The waste of Denver was a mountain of unspent thermal potential. I entered the room. The air here was humid and smelled of milk and ozone. The heaters in the incubators were working overtime, their coils glowing a dull red. I stood over the first plastic crib. The infant inside was no larger than my hand, its chest rising and falling with a terrifying fragility. It was a spark in a blizzard. I reached out, my finger hovering just inches from the plastic. The heat radiating from the child was like a physical weight. It pushed against my cold, trying to heal the void of my skin. For a moment I felt a flicker of something else. Not hunger, but a memory of weight, of blood that flowed, of a heart that beat for no reason other than the joy of the motion. Then the northest Vrain hit the building. The impact shook the entire floor. The windows of the neonatal unit shattered inward, not from the wind, but from the pressure of the ice. A wall of white, jagged frost poured into the room, swallowing the furniture, the monitors, the floor. The temperature dropped 60 degrees in a single heartbeat. The heaters in the incubators couldn't keep up. The red coils flickered and died as the Vrain's influence overwhelmed the building's failing power grid. I watched the frost creep across the plastic of the incubators. It moved like a living thing, a white vine of erasure. "The audit is impartial," I whispered to the child, who was now beginning to shiver. "It does not care for the age of the debtor. It only cares for the balance." I didn't touch the child. I didn't have to, the North. Vrain was doing the work for me. The ice climbed the legs of the crib, encasing the plastic in a translucent shell. The child's breath slowed, the mist of its exhalation growing thinner and thinner until it stopped altogether. The room was now a grotto of ice. The incubators were like prehistoric insects trapped in amber, their contents preserved in a permanent frozen stasis. I turned back to the hallway. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a vertical glacier, a monument to the end of biology. "To the Capitol," I said, my voice echoing through the frozen corridors. The heart of the state still beats. The golden dome still reflects the dying light. We shall take the heat of the law, the heat of the gathered masses, and finally the heat of the city's very soul. As we descended, I looked out a shattered window. Denver was disappearing. The grid of lights that had defined the valley for a century was being extinguished, block by block. The north of Vrain was no longer just a river. It was a tide, a white ocean that was drowning the world in a silent, perfect cold. And in the center of my chest, the hole was growing. The stolen heat of the hospital hadn't filled it. It had only made the vacuum more demanding. I was no longer just the auditor. I was the hunger itself.